Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Norway for our European Historical Regions series. This is actually the first time we make a video exclusively about Norwegian history, which is a shame considering, of course, the amount that I uploaded on different topics. I already discussed in this series Swedish and Danish history, so we have to look in depth at other parts of the Nordic world that is somehow, in fact, not just Scandinavia, as you know, and that in fact stretches beyond other regional but also cultural frontiers. I made an important amount of videos about medieval Scandinavia, about the Viking era as well in general. But as you know, I appreciate mostly the process of state building that the Scandinavian powers underwent. In fact, in this latter part of the medieval millennium, that is overlooked and somehow less popularized, but that deserves particular attention. There is really a lot also about the pre-Viking era, that period that is overlooked somehow. I will start from that, always, reminding you this is just, in fact, really a very short introduction, and I will just say a bunch of things after all. And the main aspect of this is the, of course, Scandinavian or Nordic connection with the rest of the European continent, and not all. Right, there is a phase of development in the last centuries before Christ that brought to an important advancement with the Norse adaptation of letters and the creation of their own alphabet in runic form. The contact with the Romans that are obvious but somehow overlooked, right, mostly through the exports of furs and skins in exchange for luxury goods for the Norse elites, as it happened a bit all over the, in fact, Germano-Norse world, and of course, for the latter as a whole, the Scandinavian service in the Roman military, right, and or against it, of course, mostly as mercenaries. That's a topic that I promised to expand specifically for, in fact, the Scandinavians, as you know, that we talked about the Germanic peoples broadly meant, so most of what we said is valid without any difference for the Norse as well. But what is important for today's video is, of course, how this affected Scandinavia, for example, through the creation of powerful chiefdoms, right, mostly built up on farm development, this, greater affirmation of an elite that we will see now mostly in the form of the Godar, the Godi. And so in a world in which the essentially temporal and spiritual power were all one, right, differently from later times, and so in which chieftains were also part sacred rulers. We'll talk more about this in another series, mostly in the one about the origins of knighthood, but there is much of that can lead us up to the Crusades, that also, in fact, Scandinavians such as the Norwegian king Sigurd participated from a cultural background that was, after all, not very distant from this Nordic Iron Age one. And that posed some interesting dynamics as far as properly the Christianization of the North occurred, and the aforementioned state building process, which took in Scandinavia an important amount of time, as you know, compared to the rest of Europe, because these chieftains, of course, saw in their individual rule in a country where centralization was very far compared to the broader Frankish one. Of course, were co-opted in a sort of power share, right? Not differently formally from even, in fact, the rest of the continent, but by important degree. So the chieftains function as priests. They accepted sacrifices from farmers, which were again used to pay soldiers, creating a herd that, as you know, is an informal retinue of personal and armed companions, right? What you see eventually even later as the Huskarls, right? As this idea of essentially home guards that eventually came to be the troops of the nucleus, at least of the royal army, right? And you see even in the Anglo-Danish world, think about the Jarls and the Earls, right? And so all these concepts that today we don't have time to look at in detail, but in some videos about, for example, the organization of the Viking army, also the Anglo-Saxon one, we have approached often. These chieftains were thus able to rule areas that would include several clans and tribes, and it was, it took again an important amount of time. It was a very gradual path for which mostly all these clans and tribes clashed with one another, so preventing from a broader overlordship to affirm itself. But this is exactly what happens instead during the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. So the chieftains inhabiting today's Norway, geographically speaking, increased their power during the migration period, right? Especially between the 5th and mid-6th century. For an important dynamic that, first of all, is a generalized crisis that affected a bit the entire continent, right? Great part of the migration era is triggered by the same crisis for both sides, right? The Romans weren't faring particularly well, nor the Germans or other peoples were, and of course Scandinavia depended on these dynamics too. And one that directly pressured the Norse was actually the expansion of Germanic tribes from the continent northwards, and thus kind of unhinging an important series of local political and social dynamics, mostly entailing the impoverishment of the local farmers that had somehow prospered during this Iron Age, and that were seeking for protection from the chieftains, right? So it's that process that you can easily see eventually taking shape in the full Middle Ages, like what we call feudalism, or a series of let's say of codified rules, government systems that, of course, were essentially increasing the hierarchic power for the sake of an extension of the same and a defense to the whole community and territory, as a matter of fact. And in fact, as far as the Norse and continental relation is concerned, there is an important divide, because, as you know, most of what we call as Odinism, etc., was actually molded in that meat grinder that Central Europe actually was, right? The Scandinavians were actually more Pacific than the continental Germans, which were instead much more toughly built and much more aggressive from a military point of view. What we see, of course, for example, in the late Roman Empire, we've seen it recently also for Gallic warfare, that was cited by important Germanic elements in their raids and so on, is that, in fact, peoples from Scandinavia, some mysterious ones, may have been Norse. It's just the Attekotti, but there is a bit of etymological issue there that I will not digress on this occasion. However, definitely shows that there was a sort of pre-Viking dynamic, right? So what we call essentially was a Scandinavian piracy, right? And you can't really distinguish it in any other way. These were war bands, like they existed pretty much everywhere. They just took the sea because, especially in the case of Norway, of course, the local communities were pressured between the sea and the mountains, so they didn't have many other directions. They were already to expand in, and they were predisposed mostly towards that, especially in a moment in which the big giant was crumbling in the continent. And so it's exactly what you see during the Viking era with the Carolingian crisis. And so there is more like a consequential effect that brought to these Viking eras that is completely normal, as far as also, as you can see with the Magyars or the Saracens, right? It's pretty unspecific, right? You can appreciate the seafaring capacities of the Norse, especially the Norwegians, that, as you know, were a bit more like the seafarers, the explorers of the situation, but not necessarily the ones that hit the hardest. In the migration era, the continental Germans had created powerful confederacies that eventually would territorialize on the base of the Roman population and government in kingdoms. In the Viking era, the Danes are naturally more politically and socially compact for Scandinavian standards than, in fact, the Norwegians. So this, of course, is a well-studied dynamic, but there is also kind of no border. Right? This is the actual picture that we get. There were no such things just per se, like of course the modern national identities. There was this broader, what we call Norse world that shared by approximation an important amount of cultural identity and kind of broad linguistic, of course, ethnic characteristics, but that somehow was connected to an idea of politics and of culture and of lifestyle that is traumatically different from anything that we have been habituated to, even in the so-called reconstructions about this period, that actually do not render any justice to Norse culture, but to history entirely, and that revolved mostly, in fact, around a concept of clanic stock, some sort of individual heroism, and in fact entrepreneurship of different kind. Of course, there cannot be a Viking era without farming, as much as slavery, as much as looting, as much as shipbuilding and naval engineering. So everything adapts to the needs of these peoples. That must be understood as such, and that is really done. What really strikes about the Norse during the Viking era is, of course, the impressive amount of energies that evidently the places where they lived, and mostly for men caused factors and not broadly environmental one. I mean, people can mess things up very beautifully without any need of climate change or things like that have become very fashionable. Not that I'm particularly against the idea of, say, the one, at least, of the explanation, one of the factors that are being used to explain the Viking era, such as the warming of the climate, the demographic exceedance that the local land could not support, and so the need also to not just raid, etc., but also colonize, right, and to also ethnically impact, considering the scarce demographic concentration, especially in Northern Europe, but also parts of the continent. Think about at least some parts of Normandy, such as the Cotentin, etc., where you can still see some properly Scandinavian phenotypes compared to the more populated hinterland. Well, really pushed this man as far as literally Vinland, Terra Nova, etc. All those places that eventually these same peoples re-abandon at a certain point, because it was just more like a consequence of contingential needs and not specifically outlined. Like, they were trying to see where other opportunities really were. I mean, there were some Scandinavians that in fact settled as far as the White Sea, where it's definitely not a particularly profitable place to settle, but it worked for them, right? Because when you are that pressured, you will do it. Naturally, most of the Viking era achievements, however, revolves around the impressive political and military coordination of the Norse in the raids. Firstly, in Gaul, then mostly in Britain, as far as also the Norwegian side of the story is concerned. As you know, more stereotypically, the Swedes were more about Eastern Europe, the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and of course the Mediterranean. I made a video about the Varangian Guard as well, at least in its early phase, that in fact talks mostly about this period. And again, it's embarrassing for me to make videos like this and simply saying, well, we'll just talk about them, or we already did, because it's so much stuff at a time. And one towards we were lucky to have an important degree of historiographical interest, thanks to the development of contemporary Scandinavian countries, the attention that British historiography, of course, had for the Viking era for obvious reasons. And of course, always new finds, new kind of elements that can help us integrating our own knowledge of these peoples. I made videos, for example, about the Norse Germanic religion, the actual traditional perspective that is hardly the one that you ever see in any kind of so-called neo-paganism or all this other. It's mostly trash. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the people who belong to that would be ashamed for their same ancestors. And in general, in fact, the carelessness, superficiality, and lack of comparative and diachronic capacity when we took a look at, the Vikings or medieval Scandinavia as a whole, because we say that, I assume most people nowadays just think about the Vikings, but what about the rest of medieval Scandinavia? We live in an abyss of severe ignorance, of brutal underschooling, even I speak from a Western, in a first world that I use so much as you think to flatter myself. I don't, right? Because I believe that yes, we are kind of the better people in the world, but still that our standards suck culturally, educationally to a level that is unspeakable, right? That is part of actually a broader decline. That it's not just to say, back 200 years ago everything was fine. No, it wasn't, right? As far as I'm concerned, it wasn't even 1,000 years ago. That depends on how I wake up in the morning, right? Depending on the mood. But it's just not a serious thing. And I must say that people talk a lot about the Vikings, but when I see it, even just for searching for the media I use here, from Creative Commons and all this stuff for the pictures, that for all that talk, there's actually an incredible few about the Viking era in general. I mean, of course, in general, there is even fewer in comparison to the much larger things that were happening also in other countries, etc. But even for the degree of historiographical development we have achieved, it seems like all that science doesn't actually reach the commoners, let's call them this way, and that's pretty sad. In any case, as we were saying before, what you see affirming itself in these early medieval centuries after the crisis, because we know that especially southern Norway was hit by the plague of the 6th century. So that's how as far it went, right? And this naturally brought those times, I think, by scale, hundreds of farms being depopulated. And there is a revival in the 7th century. In all this, however, you don't have to think that there was ever such a thing like the Norse weren't going at sea, right? Because we have stuff from, say, the full 500, or it's even difficult to date at some point, but we realize that Norse piracy slash trade slash whatever existed in, of course, in this case in the North Sea and beyond, throughout the whole time, right? So, of course, when we look at expeditions like the 793 one of Lindisfarne, we start appreciating mostly a degree of brutality and of aggressiveness and destructiveness that is a real thing. It has nothing to do with the terrible Christian propaganda that said that these people, yes, they said that they were monsters, because, that's normally what you think of somebody that carries out those things from the perspective of you who has just suffered it and who sticks to some particular historiographical models, etc., and because they're heathens, etc. But, is that like a wrong thing, right? Isn't it much worse that you in the third millennium cannot understand history in its context from both sides without making any moral relativism than these people actually saying these things? Let's face it, the Norse didn't write, right? Or at least they wrote in a much different way and scale and with very different purposes than the Christian world. And yes, this is a feature of fundamental underdevelopment, and I don't have to tell you just per se. So that is accompanied with a whole set of other behaviors that, just as I was saying the other day in that video about the Celtic Skordisky that you apparently like so much, is completely normal for communities like those that were chronically unstable politically, socially. They were, again, mostly pressured to do this out of desperation, because at a point when they civilized, they stopped doing this, and they became also more powerful as individual countries, as we will see today. And it had an iron logic, right? I've been talking at a point often about Viking history with people even from the same Scandinavia and so on, and there is this Manichaean, I don't even know how to qualify it. I think it's a mental disorder, but this thing of saying like, but the Vikings were not just pirates. You see, they had farms, and what is there an actual adult in the world who has any mental reason, properly cognitive need to distinguish the fact that farming and raiding can go in parallel, that slaves were used in the same farms, even of those who didn't go abroad, that these were interconnected systems. I mean, what kind of points are these? Are we phobic because people captured others and sold them? Yeah, that's slavery. That's a normal thing, right? The entire world basically was doing it. These people surely were kind of more, and there's this attempt of engentling them, right, which means to betray the purest identity that they were proud of in that regard. And so you're essentially raping history just because of your own ignorance, because you cannot accept you're being essentially brutalized into thinking that you cannot, first of all, that you must identify with these people 1,000 years ago, because what's the problem that you actually come from the same country where they were, and secondly, that however you must make up this story that you have to alleviate the fact that yes, that the Viking era basically was founded solely as such as the most prevalent Viking business on slave trade. How can you distinguish, even if you care about your own national history, that these people barely did in the way you do, by the way, and that you're, again, not making any effort to honor if you actually reason in these disgusting post-ancien regime nationalist and socialist mentalities. This constitutes a problem for you, for the image of your country. How stupid can it be? I mean, seriously. Because first of all, it tells that you know nothing about the rest of the world. Like, if you are legitimately scared that you... I know that they use the card that you are white, so it becomes a problem. I've been targeted too for the same reason, right? But that is actually overt racism. It's basically a zoological materialism that had nothing to do with, again, in fact, nor the Norse Middle Ages, nor with the minimal dignity of mankind, and that you're just basically superstitiously sacrificing ritually to hope not to be targeted. What kind of spineless, vile, and cowardly being are you, right? And I say the same thing again for all those who buy the alt-right or far right, which is actually pure leftistic view of, again, this was the super people that did all the thing that the others didn't. They were pure and free, and the others were all a bunch of bitches that were being subjugated by the church. And essentially it means shutting your eyes, ears, but sadly not enough mouth in front of any actual moral and scientific dignity, and of course any form of first world primary education. This is the world we're heading towards, at least directionally speaking. There is still a hope to revert it, but the same Norse believed, of course, in the storming of the Asgard. So if the Age of the Wolf is coming, that's at least been certified and approved by traditional knowledge. And I actually have a great interest towards the Vikings, even if, as I said before, I don't talk about them too much, right? And the reason is, unfortunately enough, this kind of premises I have to do anytime I talk about them, because otherwise it seems that you don't know what kind of position you can take. I think it seems as if the majority of the group thinks that if you make a video, even just on medieval Norway, you're either a white supremacist, or yeah, I mean, you are a white supremacist in the first place, but just depending on what the other person thinks about, whether they're okay with that, so that because they're white supremacists themselves, or they're not okay with that because they want to kill white people, right? And that's basically where it gets down to nowadays. And again, this belongs to the fourth estate, and these people are just, again, the ones who are going to go under. Just like they were going under at that time, right? Being under somebody else. So they deserve that. So let them talk, right? If you are scared by that, it means that you basically are scared by the chthonic forces that the Asen simply crushed without even, perfectly knowing that it would have defeated them. By, as I said before, especially in the Nordic mythology, there is always this more incumbent sense of doom, as you know, which is also useful because it makes you more aware, as they had to be in those times where, again, everything was dramatically unstable, and so there was no other way but to live like that. But it also, does betray a part of the world was already aging and forgetting, and falling short of standards and of expectations, because the Middle Ages are already ahead in that actual traditional path. In any case, the early medieval crisis was naturally surpassed relatively quickly, also in Norway, like in basically most of the continent. Most of the aforementioned farms abandoned during the Justinian's plague were repopulated in the 7th century. Right, we see, for example, the construction of several fishing hamlets, a boom in trade of iron and soapstone across the North Sea. So these are all interesting indicators of both kind of an elite, but not even so elite, production and trade that also expands geographically its horizons. In fact, all this trade was naturally monopolized by the chieftains, right? At least most of it, meaning that, again, these were clienteling societies, a bit like the mob, if not actually the mob, and the process of a chiefdom building had exactly been built in that sense of, however, order making that couldn't be achieved in other ways. We will, as I was saying before, deepen on another occasion the important relation between, of course, this continental Germanic dimension was much more tough politically and institutionally on Scandinavia, right? But you can already see, I don't know, in the Vendel period, all these beautiful figures of the heroes, for example, on horseback, right? You know that Scandinavia, broadly meant in a cultural sense, just even the Jutland, were the northern Germans, let's say, were not particularly much of an equestrian military culture. They had at least a few horses, but a few ones they had, not even that few in absolute terms, by the way, because if you look, for example, what the Danes did in their plains is also in terms of horse breeding is pretty interesting, for the sake of war. But I mean, I say compared to the other Germans, mostly, that had received a massive injection also of Reitervölker in the process. Of course, they had less cavalry, but like all Indo-European cultures, of course, this idea that the hero is essentially a knight, not a random guy on horseback, but literally one thing, right, with it, like a sort of centaur, that is guided by divine glory, and that has his alter ego in the sword. In this phase that, as you know, was expanding. Also, metallurgically speaking, you know that from the late Roman Empire, you have the Noricum, which had traditionally been, in fact, the most advanced center in Europe as far as arms and armor production. From the Celtic background, also the Romans used the Calbis Noricum, was basically steel, aside from the various classifications you can make of more or less carbonized iron. Shifts to essentially the upper Rhine valley, and from there, you know that there is a straight water highway that not just reaches, of course, the North Sea, but actually goes up along the Norwegian, the western Norwegian coast, but it's also basically south from the southern one, the only it has, and it connected importantly these populations. You know that an important deal of Viking era's wars was also Frankish in production. So the same route existed in Roman times, and all this fact is naturally always overlooked because of the fact that the Norse didn't actually write much, didn't leave us much information about those periods as well. So even for most of the Nordic Iron Age, we rely, of course, on archaeology, but never underestimate how much they were actually involved in the continent. Yes, there were Norwegian mercenaries who served in the Roman army, in the Carolingian army, and not just even as mercenaries as we could intend, because it was a mercenary technically. Right, these people were proud. We know of Danish burials that show that these warriors were they were loyal to their clan, to their origins, to their identity, but they were also things like proud Roman soldiers, which is incredibly important. Also for all a series of military considerations about the development of these peoples that have been somehow even stereotyped in Viking era as they weren't so, after all, developed. They had a few cavalry, or they used simpler tactics. But if you actually look at what they were able to put together during, besieging Paris in the end of the 9th century, even with essentially with siege, with catapults, as a matter of fact, well, you realize that whenever they had, of course, the means, they knew how to use them, and there is no reason why they shouldn't have. So the Viking era, I call it era, it's called perhaps more properly age, but never mind, was just, as we've seen, a period of expansion through trade, raids, colonization. The beginning is considered the aforementioned 793, which is somehow just symbolical, but it's still revealing the the scale of damage could be done, even though just local in that case, because a lot of these bands roamed around since ever, right? It's just like the Picts, the Scots, etc. We've seen it. They had modest political power. They were essentially at best as chiefdoms at the heads of multiple clans at a time. So against important political territorial creations such as the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, even just the Anglo-Saxons or other, you can see all their limit, right? But as far as especially the, say, Central Western Europe is concerned, and so this Carolingian giant at the time that wasn't properly a state, but essentially an enormous quasi-feudal power that, having stopped expanding as it got outstretched, it didn't have any other mean of sustaining itself but through infighting. Of course, there would be a gigantic, colossal opportunity for all these pirates slash mercenaries slash traders, etc., to interfere with the local powers, also amicably, because if you have studied, I don't know, the history of Western Francia, you know that the problem was that the same Frankish lords that of course were there to stay territorially, differently from the Vikings, except for the lower Sand Valley, that is still not this enormous thing in the bigger scale of things, sided with the Vikings, traded with them, sold weapons to them, right? And this was, again, evidently a matter of also Scandinavian dependency on these systems, not just kind of an exploitatory one, right? Even if Gaul was, for example, severely hit, etc., at the end of the day, the Franks, when this thing was, becoming too imposant to bear, they start building fortified bridges. They stop, and these invasions that turned mostly towards Britain, that was instead more permeable in many ways. And this is also what, on the longer run, the Germans do with the Magyars, the Italians do with the Saracens, and so on. So actually, post-Carolingian Europe was from a condition of force over these so-called second invaders, that, however, in the moment of the crack, had the greatest room for maneuver. And consider, as we were saying before, properly the change that the Viking era entailed for Scandinavia as such, because the Viking expeditions were ever better organized, and as a consequence, the Norse chieftains were ever more involved professionally in that business that, as you understand, entailed also a big deal of military competence. So it's fair to say that the Vikings were generally well equipped, well trained, right? Their elite wore chain mail armor. They preferred important, more infantry-suited weapons, such as the so-called Danish axe, that actually was a Frankish thing, as a matter of fact, that, however, found an important development in the north, because exactly, the Franks were becoming mostly horsemen, right? At least the decisive element was about someone who could not just afford a chainmail or a weapon like an axe or the equivalent in the form of a sword by other, say, not really an equivalent, but still something that was, however, suited for mounted combat. You can't use a Danish axe on horseback, just as much as you can't use a double-handed sword on horseback, right? So among the Norse that mostly fought on foot, the Danish axe was more functional to what literally these people had to do, that is to say, properly to split open a person through that, and with a chainmail in between. Naturally, the thing was complicated in the graphic way I'm describing, but of course chainmail were still somehow the appanage of a few that challenged each other very often in this kind of quasi still heroic warfare. but that, as we have explained a bit in some apological videos, had the purpose of breaking armor. Right? When you realize what these weapons had to do, were of course incapacitating the adversary in many other ways, but fundamentally every blade that was created at that point, especially before the introduction of plate armor, was essentially designed to cut through armor. Doesn't matter how destroyed the same weapon would become at that point, but blow after blow, the optimal hit was designed to cause damage, right? Enough to break the armor. Maybe not to actually penetrate directly, but still with this, in fact, massive force that we know. Actually, the double-handed axes of Viking era were pretty light, right? I don't think they surpassed anything like 1.5 kilos. Then it depended also on the size of the warrior, because of course weapons were designed on that base. So aside from cases of giantism, for which you can't see massive beasts, let's say nothing heavier than 3.5 kilos was ever wielded in battle, as a matter of fact. And in any case, this is just the 1 versus 1, and you know that in practice, military speaking, this is almost worthless. Of course, the elite was the spearhead of the army, just like it could be in a continental context, and that's why it's elite in the first place. But the Vikings had an important degree of, for example, cavalry warfare, missile warfare, and you know, even from actually less powerful peoples, such as the Picts, for example, that combined armed tactics were quite advanced in general, right? And so the Norse deserve much more credit in that broader northern European region, because they were toughened up by this Viking business. Today we do not explain also how and why necessarily the Norse, etc. That requires a bit more of a topic, but everybody knows, for example, through Iberno Norse history, that compared to the Celts, the Vikings were really bringing like a very advanced military culture, and yet that wasn't enough to control the main Irish strongholds that also in the modern country, as you know, stem from essentially Viking ring forts, right? And however, just as we were saying the other day in the video about the lordship of Ireland, still that Norse element is an integrating part of today's Irish culture per se, as a historical legacy. And the Viking business was as brutal as remunerative, because otherwise they would have not invested so much in it. The raids were mostly aiming at gold and silver, which was also one reason why the rich monasteries in the Roman Frankish Catholic tradition were particularly loaded in with the paraphernalia, But of course, humans were remunerative too. As you know, in Norse, the term for the slaves, let's say, it's thrall, right? And these were essentially just traded with the entire North, mostly among cultures that were also more kind of slave-oriented. Let's say that these are the centuries in which in the continent the ancient colonist is transitioning as a sort of Massarius of some sort, right? So there is also an improvement in the juridical condition that you can arguably see in Scandinavia also after the Viking era per se, but it's obvious that most, again, of the Viking traffics were based on slavery, so mostly also the individual autonomy of a slave was pretty limited, right? Never commit the mistake of thinking that less industrially scaled slave societies treated slaves better, right? Of course, by systemically speaking, it's possible that they cared more about the single one because they had less resources to waste. But we have, given the scale of violence of the Norse world, a pretty good evidence of the fact that, first of all, nobody cared even too much about which condition you were, unless you were just already some upper, somebody affiliated with a boss of the local mob. And secondly, also freemen made pretty bloody ends without too many problems. Frankly, this is a feature that gets up to the royal level, as we will see now. It's, however, important to stress the importance of the trials for the farms workforce. And the farms, the holdings at home were also importantly supervised by the local. Of course, there were men who remained, but also by the wives. And this, however, doesn't have to make you think that Scandinavian women were at all freer than other women, say, just because this was still a pagan reality. Because you literally hear people stating this. I wish they had ever opened a book of history of law and of medieval law to say such things. There is no such thing in these words as freedom, right? This is just a hippie mythology of alienated fourth estate or national socialism. It has no adherence with reality. All these people are bound, first of all, not to the gods, because there is already a single god, right? All the gods that you see there, that also neo-paganism emphasizes in an anti-monotheistic sense, which is also wrong as a properly monotheistic concept, at least in the way it hypostasized as such, but it's not wrong in the sense that it was a single one. There is only one God and one truth, also in the traditional, what we call pagan world, or the Eden religion, if you prefer. In this case, that is also debatable as a term. But in any case, this clarifies these differences, that must say that there were different gods, and going against properly still the unitary meaning that those gods had compared as essentially an emanation, as an hypothesis of the one, right? And this is also pretty known if you know the genealogy of the Norse mythology, that at the end of the day it's the same of all the other Indo-European peoples. So every person consequently belonged to somebody else. Women, notoriously enough, weren't free. Only men, actually, by the right of bearing arms, could be free, and thus noble, and thus provided with some sort of divine power. Women actually weren't, right? In this rigidly patriarchal, as all Indo-European religions really were, the woman has more sensibly more protection juridically than a man, for obvious reason. But as a consequence, she belongs to a man, right? So the fact that people say, but they could divorce, well, even in Christianity they could divorce. There was always a valid reason for doing so, in some ways, but this has nothing to do with the actual freedom of the woman. I mean, not even most men were actually free. We were always bound to somebody, and properly the categorical concept of freedom did not exist, because every person was different in worth, in price, in achievements, in value in the first place. So it's a concept properly doesn't make any sense on any traditional base, and was rigidly separated as far as the male and the female were concerned. And yes, there were Norse female warriors, absolutely, like in any other people, as a matter of fact, and this has nothing to do with the allegedly common scale of female military involvement, which is on the actual evidence of graves excavated with, women buried with arms and armor, any evidence of any systemic or structural involvement of Norse women in war, right? That's just an extravagance stemming from, again, the aforementioned nationalistic, socialistic feminism that has nothing to do with any trace of scientific or moral dignity in the first place. Just read what actual Norse people were about and how they lived. It just takes, again, a basic medieval law class. It should be enough to dispel all this BS. For that matter, and this is more interesting, what really concerns the development of Scandinavia in this period is the tension towards a form of kingship, right? That is pioneered by these men. The idea is that the Vikings actually break traumatically with the former Norse tradition as far as power is concerned, right? That's why the first reason why you shouldn't ever watch Vikings in the first place is that it begins with the opposite concept, the terrible evil king that prevents the poor, open-minded Viking to go abroad just to do what they did, by the way. And why? Because the public audience is, again, the dramatically undereducated fourth estater doesn't have to feel challenged about her own personal irrelevance by showing how it actually was at the time, that the stronger had the right to rule on the weaker, right? And if you belong to the fourth estate, that's definitely something you don't want to hear, and that's why things like Vikings or any other, by the way, reconstruction, most don't watch movies, series, or anything if you have any historical interest. It's just stupid. You have history, learn history from books, which is already quite complicated to do by itself. And that broke, in fact, with the aforementioned order, especially there are many examples also in this case for the colonization of Iceland, etc. The problem was, yes, we grab new land and who is going to rule it, right? Who is going to become more powerful, considering that these colonists still were connected to clans, to, again, chieftains at home, and coming back with a lot of loot, etc., could brutally unhinge the entire local political and social system, because you could simply start invading other clans, subjugating them, massacring, and this is exactly what started happening. Through, however, the fort, unevenly unitary direction and effort, so hardly what, again, paranoid people would like to say, oh my god, these people were brutal, so they were bad. Actually, no, that's how we built the world we are in, right? And most of the problems are born out of people who don't want to cooperate, not the people that make others actually move when there is a right decision to make, and they just want to maintain their lesser privilege that as such can be wiped out by the stronger, right? So that's the actual point. So the lack of suitable farming land in Western Norway, for obvious geographical reasons, caused the locals to travel and to colonize sparsely populated areas such as Shetland, the Orkney, the Faroe Islands, and the Hebrides, the latter which became the Kingdom of the Isles that I discussed, at least in the army organization. I have a video about, again, the, say, Viking history, Scandinavian history, Scottish history, wherever you want to frame it, different playlists. That Norway would maintain a control on until very late in time, right? The King of the Isles, as you know, until the very end of the Middle Ages, but properly for example, the control of the Scottish mainland coast, well up to the Battle of Largs of 1263, and with an important influence also on the local customs, genetics, in fact, language, lifestyle, military development. This is particularly important. I made a video about for example, the West Highlanders in late medieval warfare. Norwegian Vikings settled on the east coast of Ireland to around the beginning of the 9th, the end of the 8th century, and they founded the island first settlements of at least that scale of importance, including the same Dublin, as we were saying before, but Cork, Waterford, I mean, all the major Irish cities that, of course, are also on the coast. An interference which was so invasive to trigger the notoriously divided and quarreling Gaelic kings to ally, right? And by 900, driving out at least the main Norse establishment, part of which naturally married into the local Gaels as well. The mid-9th century also saw the largest chieftains of the same Norse-Pethic kingdoms engaged in major power struggle. Right, this was a moment in which a lot of wealth was coming in Scandinavia through the Viking raids, and allowing through the aforementioned mechanism more power for lordships to be affirmed. Right, and here we locate the character Harald Fairhair, right, who is credited essentially as the first king of Norway. He's called Fairhair in English historiography, and as we can imagine, he may have been the blondest guy ever. But the actual term from the from the Scandinavian historiography means hints mostly at literally at fairness as a ruler, right? Whose existence has even been questioned on the base that there is a very few regarding him as a historical figure, mostly coming from the following centuries. But it's important, however, to observe how the eventual Norwegian kings would have been legitimized on the base of the descendants from Harald, whose dynasty lasted until, in fact, the late Middle Ages continuously, and there were different kings ruling at once. They were somehow all married into each other, right? Which was a way also to, in fact, to strengthen kind of an elite establishment. And that, in the local historiography since the Middle Ages, was properly identified as the first ruler of a unified Norway. And naturally, this achievement, had it been accomplished at the time, which is perfectly possible, right, through especially the alliance with the Earls of Lade that would remain for most of the High Middle Ages, the second power compared to the Fairhair dynasty, managed to consolidate, say, a trend of further power concentration, right? And the legend goes that Harald achieved the Norwegian unification through the Battle of Hafrsfjord, which is dated conventionally, if I'm not wrong, in 872. But again, it's reality is disputed. But if it did happen, as many naval battles that were happening at the time among the same Norse, it was in the last 30 years of the 9th century. And again, it's perfectly accurate, but the only problem is that we don't have the certainty it really happened as a historical thing specifically, per se, but the mechanism is spot on. It's the only possible, right, they could through which they could achieve such temporary unity of Norway, which, as we'll explain now, was always very complicated to keep together. It's a similar history even to the one of Sweden that we already described as pretty tormented ways. Sweden was actually worse because it was kind of larger, right, and also yes, it was more populated, but not that easier of a terrain than Norway, as a matter of fact. That probably in this kind of mostly coastal, base succession was somehow more. It was easier to rationalize from a political point of view. There are the various districts that correspond roughly to those divisions still existing today from the Middle Ages. So, as you understand, also naval dimension in Norway was kind of more important for properly the control of the same country compared to all the other main Scandinavian powers, because at the end of the day, Denmark, Sweden were more like open in the interland, and they were thus more like an extensionally terrestrial power. And some say, at least I studied, Nicole made some videos about Scandinavian warfare, that the Norwegians may have been more skilled, not just in naval warfare per se, which was, however, pretty much at that time a Norse business by comparable standards, but also perhaps greater archers, because naval warfare, as you understand at the time, entailed basically a sort of bombardment with arrows and stones and just boarding after that, and at a distance, right on these rocky cliffs and all, the kind of amphibious warfare could follow. Say missile power, a bit like the Genoese, right, between the sea and the mountains, right, all developing a bit more of a missile warfare. It's a very deterministic interpretation. I don't marry it just per se, but it's possible. At least it's possible there was a factor that would increase that effectiveness that, however, all the Norse and all the surrounding peoples were somehow skilled in, right? At least, as we've seen, the Norse had an important edge over the Celts, but also, of course, also over the, for example, the Ugro-Finnic populations of the interland. At this point, the Norwegians also rise up towards the north, right? So just like the Swedes from the other side, and that's a pretty interesting frontier with the Finnmark and all that we will perhaps see in another video. Iceland, that at that point was uninhabited, but it was known, of course, since the ancient times, was rediscovered, assuming that they had even ever forgotten about it, by the Norwegians. Mostly they were the closest geographically, the ones that would invest the most in it, and would, as we'll see now, incorporate it properly in their kingdom, or at least through an important degree of autonomy, autonomous institutions. But the result being, by 930, the island having been divided among 400 Norse chieftains, who established themselves, in fact, in these 4 main districts that were split, in theory, among other 9 sub ones, plus other 3 technically, because there are 39 historically in Iceland, with an important degree of, let's say, commonality of egalitarian institutions, right, that would remain a bit the character of Iceland per se. And part of the reason, of course, that there were few resources there, so it was difficult to centralize everything. But still, mostly this was a peripheral land that the Norwegians had settled in, and so what the Icelanders were technically just the same colonists, gradually diversifying from the mainland, but still remaining deeply connected and dependent on it. The king Akon the Good, the son of Harald Fairhair, raised in England, assumed the crown in 930, and established 2 large things, that is to say, assemblies made up of the free people of the community, right, presided over by a law speaker, in which the sovereign would, in fact, negotiate for the common decision of the country. This was an important, just like the Diet in the empire, things like that, moment of political testing, because the men came together with their retinues. It was an important show-off, competition, negotiation moment, and it just was like an appeal to royal authority in some way, or at least by showing up there, there were opportunities, right? Not just, giving random power to the king. This was always provided for something in exchange, right? But it's obvious that over time, these assemblies became the instrument to sediment power of the elites altogether, and thus going towards an ever greater hierarchical direction. The things were two: the Gulating for Western Norway and the Frostating for Trøndelag. And Hakon also established the Leidang, mobilization of the army navy. Actually made a video specifically on it, which again was the standard freeman levy that had always existed everywhere, and that, however, was further, defined, agreed, etc., and towards a direction that, as we have seen in the aforementioned video, was also there, just essentially favoring a more efficient rota system, because not all the manpower, of course, was used at a given time. This is exactly how they also planned the various Viking expeditions, and so on. And that, however, would tend, the Leidang continued throughout the Middle Ages to eventually colonize also other parts, like from Denmark, we've seen in the Baltic and so on, in Christian times. That was commuted as a service always with more mostly in some kind of resources. Barter was essentially at this point the only kind of payment, but gradually there was like the levying of ever more rationalized tributes from the local communities that in this way could be exempted from the actual physical service, or at least by some part, in entrusting power, means, resources, etc., to the king's huskarls. And the fact of this professional military, that even just this essentially bodyguards, again, like the Masnata in the continent and so on, were taking over entire systems. It's just like in the Anglo-Saxon world, the Fyrd, as the general levy of the Anglo-Saxon freemen, was declining at the affirmation of the Danish huskarl system, as the fact it had gotten down to, right? That is to say, people, this is basically the establishment of sort of feudalism, where the people work for the military elite just to fight, and the two estates distinguishing themselves ever more, but with a larger and more effective, a larger scaled and more effective organization and capacity to levy resources and rationalize them and centralizing them and so on. This was necessary given the constant state of warfare, right? The endemic conflictuality, the fact that these peoples were just seeking for, again, a pacifier, somebody that would dispense them of the greatest burdens, let's say, especially in terms of life cost, to pacify the land and allowing them, yes, to work basically their entire lives, but just having to mind just that and not having to take matters in their own. Also because it was a way to equally disarm the locals, right? If you were a powerful chieftain with a strong retinue, you could simply terrorize the local populace to the point of simply rendering them incapable, militarily speaking. This is, of course, true just by an extent, because especially the Scandinavian levies were always, in relative terms, stronger than other areas in Europe, right? They weren't necessarily stronger in absolute terms, But given the very gradual and thus long state building and the difficulties of the Scandinavian monarchies to centralize, there would always be this kind of communities scattered in the hinterland that were practically impossible even to subjugate in great numbers, because they were pretty warlike, and the local government could do a few, even just to keep in check the main noblemen that also were supported by these militias as well, right? Naturally, there is a very scarce level of even late or Middle Ages of urban development, right? Most of the communes that form in Scandinavia are just basically leagues of villages that wanted to get town rights by the king just to oppress fundamentally their neighbors as other villagers. So that's basically where it gets down to. But it's a much more, as you understand, rarefied reality demographically speaking. The nature is terrifying, and so less resources are present for everyone to concentrate power to a dramatic degree by especially continental standards. After the death of Akon the Good in 960, consider all these kings are a bit like we know something about them, but most it's legendary at this point, right? However, what is clear, and it also is absolutely accurate, is that war broke out between the Fair Hair dynasty and the Earls of Lade in alliance with the Danish kings. Because this is another important feature, that kingship was exercised here, not in we are now just, there is a pre-established people and territory which we know this is going to be Norway per se, or whatever. Mostly we're talking about maritime lordships across the straits, but with this important interference, especially between Denmark and southern Sweden and southern Norway. That was mostly, again, a matter of how many ships you could put at sea and to keep them and train the crews adequately, and thus how to exert pressure and draw resources through tributes from these people. Some of it was just like, you will serve in my fleet as well, and so on. So everything took a really long time to develop in something more unitary. However, exactly because of this relative lack of control, many adventurers were expanding the boundaries of the same Norwegian-born people settlement. For example, Eric the Red settled with a group of Icelanders on Greenland in the 80s of the 10th century. Consider that the reason why he traveled so far is that his father had been punished for manslaughter, right? So these are the reasons why you may actually want to search for fortune somewhere else. And so the tribal justice did work by some degree, of course, but it was also very much intertwined with private personal reasons, and it was, again, just a clash between mobsters fundamentally. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, came across Newfoundland in around 1000 AD, naming it Finland, right? Which probably has to do with the weather, the idea that they could grow grapes there, or at least, berries, because that's what mostly exists in the Scandinavian tradition, because, as you know, the vineyards do not make it up to too far north in Europe. And however, unlike Greenland, that was to be permanently populated, the settlement in America fundamentally stopped, probably because of the opposition of the local natives, but generally speaking also for the just for the interests of the Norse, because that's where it also gets down to. And there are, dating from this time, some exceptional Viking ships found, mostly in burial mounds, that are being discovered thanks to the most updated technology, even just without digging in them, right? And so there is a lot to dig. Still, that costs a lot, but we can already admire some of the most beautiful ships in Oseberg, in Gokstad, and so on. There is a recent discovery in Alden, right? But again, there is plenty of others that have yet to be properly found, right? Also, long houses, of course, of the time are found. There's everywhere in Europe too much to dig, right? And these are just, this is just the far north. So imagine also elsewhere. Where do you find the money, right? Christianization and the abolition of the traditional Asatru reflected in Norse mythology was first attempted by Akon the Good, right, and later by Olaf Tryggvason, who, however, was killed in the Battle of Svolder, according to Legion at list. He is Saint Olaf of Norway. The Asatru would be the so-called heathenism, so this kind of, what we call paganism in other ways, improperly, but based on the concept of heathen of honor. So all of these kind of broader practices that were carried out ritually and or believed, but in a very uncategorical way, that were part of the traditional universal past, at least in that form at that point, because as we've seen, Christianity that came to document it, thanks to literacy and so on, was already spreading among the Norse autonomously for many reasons. I made multiple videos about this topic, and so the concept that the Christians arrived and these peoples were essentially deprived of their own culture and forbidden is greatly inaccurate, to say the least, right? Aside from some populations that were properly conquered in conflicts that had also barely to do with anything religious, consider the Saxons harassing the Franks, launching raids as far as the Rhineland continuously, and not stopping, and the Carolingians solving the problem for good, especially in Scandinavia, given that there was no central power in practice, and aside from the conversion of the local kings, there was an incredibly gradual mechanism that just corresponds in the pagan tradition to so-called pagan tradition to the loss of awareness of the sacred in the hearts of men, right? So, and that doesn't have to do with a category of a religious category, let's say like theism or polytheism or the stuff. Interpreting it in this key is just not having the palest idea of not what Christianity or hedonism, for what they are called, like, were. That is to say, actually the same religion, even though, again, you hardly ever hear of such an explanation. But that's because we have completely lost a universal perspective. We confuse different interpretations of the same thing for what it was commonly believed to the core, right? Not to saying the idea of, we all think about the same God. Not, there's an actual set of, there's an actual doctrine that was identical to each other, just different areas of Europe developed by different degrees, right? And these Scandinavian ones were not even actually among the most developed. And this knowledge was well preserved also in Christian times through the classical past, etc. So again, very often, again, people have no clue what I'm talking about regarding these parameters, because again, they have been fed with the lie that of the aforementioned dynamic. Two opposite religions that had nothing to do with each other, and by the way, understood in terms of moral criteria in very subjective, relativistic ways. And one came and imposed and destroyed culture and civilization, because for many reasons that even have to do with Reformation, with things that again have nothing to do even with the religions of the time, the religion, I would say more properly. But in any case, the important here being that Norway starts gradually Christianizing from an institutional point of view, and this obviously reflects the enormous advantages that would derive from it as far as this local sovereigns were concerned. That is to say, extending a stable political territorial domination that the ecclesiastical administration simply entailed by the construction of more permanent buildings. Most stuff in Scandinavia actually was built with wood, right, including the beautiful state churches you can still see until basically the 13th century. You start seeing an important degree of masonry. But the idea properly of having permanent territorial infrastructures, not just as for the church, but just setting that mode also of a priestly hierarchy would be controlled by the king, but still through an international connection and dependency on the Roman papacy, and so the enormous benefits would derive from such process of acculturation, and again of political and social growth that you start seeing also easily. What is the end of the Viking era? You know that most Viking settlements, that especially the most important trade points, this is very evident in the Baltic archaeological, go depopulated with the end of the Viking era. And in the process, this means that, of course, a great deal of the aforementioned slavery stopped, the slave trade stopped, because, you know, basically both England, continental powers, etc., came to be more, more stable places, also intertwined, in the case of Britain, with the most advanced, that case, Danish power that had pioneered, in fact, the state building. So these peoples stop exploiting that situation of instability and start consolidating territorially on their own. And again, it's hard, because these battles that you hear, and of course also the martyrdom of Saint Olaf, that was in fact Olaf the second after the Tryggvason we mentioned before, had started in 1015 to make the things pass church laws, right? And destroyed Edenhofs, built churches, and created an institution of priests. All processes that, especially the thing here, passing church laws, makes you understand how framed within still the fact that universal traditional religion, the same ecclesiastical message was actually delivered and received and exploited, right? So again, it's a gradual process. We, of course, know, at least we understand, that these sovereigns may have easily even been attached to the older practice themselves, but that they were Christian and Edens at the same time, also because Christianity is, as a matter of fact, more exclusivistic, because it's a more unitary creed. It's much more, systematically structured, also as far as properly the church as an institution and its administration is concerned. While Edenism was somehow mostly like a take on life, just as Christianity, that was more open to the concept of integrating something that could be used, right, out of a mere contractualism that sometimes in the sagas, albeit of course from Christian times, you start seeing also expressed as a need of the locals that had maybe just invested in a specific cult, in a specific sanctuary around which, say, your own family revolved in terms of local power, and then you would be overthrown, right? And so this chronic instability was essentially destroying even the validity of the old hypostatizations of the various gods that were just actually a chthonic product of the bigger wall, and that was causing probably within the conscience of these peoples also the need that you find in different, even in other times of Western thought and philosophy, this sense of reaction, like saying we need that, the recovery of that more unitary principle. And Christianity was presenting with that, and also with all those other practical opportunities that came with that, with authority, order, discipline, and more, that in a political and social sense were ever more than needed, as we've seen in Scandinavia. So it's obvious that the kings, as the most powerful rulers, would mostly tend to support Christianity, as opposed to the other chieftains that, as soon as they came to power, would do the same thing, but in their previous status would fear that the church controlled by the king would rob them of the power as godar in the traditional Norse paganism, right? And this is the reason why the story goes that St. Olaf was banned from Norway in 1028, and when he tried to return 2 years later, he was met by the locals in the Battle of Stiklestad, where he was killed in accordance with the law. Now, this is also part of the Norwegian national mythology, because St. Olaf eventually is named properly the perennial ruler of Norway, right? And exactly because of his sanctity, etc. But, for example, the Battle of Stiklestad seemingly never happened, right? Sources actually says that Olaf was assassinated, which may have happened in a clash, because I don't know that we're talking about Norway, but just to make you understand, in Iceland, the bloodiest battle ever thought, so just I think 110 killed, right? So this weren't just brawls, as we were saying before, but we don't know here specifically whether an actual battle was fought or something. In any case, the mystique, the prestige, and the legacy of St. Olaf are enormous for not just for Norwegian national identity, but for the same European religious spirituality. And you can definitely find, as we were saying before, a dramatic legacy of the aforementioned, heathenism, even in the values of these men and how they had lived and how they were killed. Because they actually lived as they had always done. They were military leaders themselves, and they didn't differ practically more than much for others. But the greatest ruler was qualified, as we've seen already in the tradition, also on the base of military power. It's the same concept of the emperor, right? Because it's a God-given power. And so sanctity could be, and perhaps even in this Norse context, more easily attributed to a political leader. And that's how the thing took form, actually. The church elevated Olaf to sainthood, and Nidaros, that is today's Trondheim, became the Christian center of Norway. As we will see, its ecclesiastical province would come to incorporate the entire country. And in all this, and I'm making it all very simple, for which we'll have to descend in the chronological details of it all, consider that within a few years, also the Danish rule had become sufficiently unpopular, that Norway again united because of the Metus of Stilis under a Norwegian king, that is Magnus Olafsson, known as the Good, in 1035, right? And the Danish thing is important because, according to the legend, the battle of Stiklestad was in which Olaf was killed, was in fact won by this rival nobility, also made up of farmers. In fact, it takes the name of the peasant army by a degree, but that however were loyal to Knut the Great, right? Canute, Knut the Great, essentially the greatest, I'd say the most powerful Norse leader of those times, that, as you know, created what is called a North Sea Empire, this maritime dominion that brought him to be actually also a very good king of England at the times, but also king of Denmark and of Norway in the process. So they were always, of course, quarreling between Denmark and southern Norway, as the latter being the most developed area, of course, of the country, for this control, because it was important just to, to be secure from the north, with this very close proximity that, as you understand, also by ship can be gapped very easily with raids, etc. And yes, these are powerful rulers now, but they don't have a direct territorial control of everything. So the problem is not even properly stopping the enemy on the shores, but ensuring that the local chieftains do not exploit this to rebel to you and join in this rebellion, like it happened also, actually supporting a foreigner to Olaf. This motive will come back also in late Norwegian history, as we'll see now, because at some point the locals countered, let's say, preferred to favor foreign intervention as opposed to give power to the king further. This was an issue, actually. And just to make you understand how instrumental it was, of course, mostly this power came from Denmark, that was more advanced in that kind of authoritarian power, right? So ideologically things were very mixed, and you can't simply draw such simple dichotomies. The stronger had the possibility of destabilizing the weaker, but also paying the price of not being able to rule it so easily like it would have done if he had maybe just cooperated with them. So it really depends on the circumstances, but it's also a way to draw resources, and that's where the Kalmar Unionen basically got down to in perspective too. In any case, from the 40s in of the 11th and the 30s of the 12th century, Norway, aside from the local feuds that could arise, and of course they weren't particularly peaceful times per se, but was fundamentally stable, right? There weren't many internal disruptions, right? It was a moment of important state building. At this point, as you understand, the Viking era has stopped, and actually the Norwegians are a bit protagonists in that, in a romantic way, in that 1066, because, as you know, Harald Hardrade, half-brother of Saint Olaf, 2 meters tall, who at 14, I don't know how many hundreds of troops had under his command. He fought in the Rus, he fought for Constantinople, he fought in Sicily. Like, it's just perhaps the greatest hero of the Viking era, becomes king of Norway, and he invades England in 1066, but he is defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Right, there's all the story from Snorri Sturluson that we'll see also in his political involvements now, just in the way of the divine wrath killing Harald with an arrow in the eye, just like the story of actually Harold Godwinson in that same tense. I mean, the same king who had defeated him at Stamford Bridge against the Normans, dying in the same way. So it's all that background that we partially saw also recently in that video about the Anglo-Normans. Recently, but we have to talk more about Anglo-Danish England, I think, because it's a period that deserves more credit. And dying, right, brings an end, not actually to Norwegian involvement in Britain, but not even in England, at least in potential, right? There were important issues the Normans had to fight for a long time to quell the Anglo-Saxon revolts. So there was always an option for things to change. At some point, as we will see, the Norwegian kings were offered prestigious places, even including becoming Irish kings, high kings in the High Middle Ages, etc. But the Viking era, as we know it, at least ends as far as properly this case the Norwegian, the Danish, etc. expansionism was westward directed in a way that could further destabilize powers like, in fact, Norman England, etc. There is also an awareness about the end of that broader sphere of game, because it had mostly been revolving around England, right? And Norway had, still the resources to have its own say in 1066, as we've seen. After that defeat was also pretty symbolic, and that's why we eventually chose it as the end of the Viking era. Having said this, in 1130, it said a civil war era in Norway breaks out. This would last essentially until the 40s of the 13th century. And this stemmed from a succession crisis, as the Norwegian monarchy had been already established per se, but again, it was much about power sharing with other kings of the same royal blood and one of other families, right, that were to convene, as we've seen in the thing, or the things actually, to eventually support or not royal rule. As we've seen before, a part of the royal interest overlapped with one of the elites, because it was about creating essentially little monarchies, as the fact that they had come to be in these various districts, to co-opt them better, also for the monarchy to have more direct points of reference and more capacity to at least know that a policy could be followed by, at least could be regulated by a single player, not many at once, even though locally there still were some autonomies recognized to the various lords that are slowly turning into like the other lords in Europe, right, as knights, as building castles. Naturally, in Scandinavia, this takes a much more, modest scale, but the essence of these individuals especially remains the same. Also because that was the thing, or as long as it was only about them, right, the thing worked like in the other places. The main issue was creating a more powerful hierarchy and making sure that these knights also could enforce their rule locally, and not being challenged by too many farmers, right, in the process. So gradually this lordship, for aforementioned reasons, need of protection, social certification, etc., increases, right? And normally the Norwegian kingdom had been working through the joint rule, as we've seen, of the king's son, normally, or other kings, being provided with some portions, like a portion each, right? So, like in other countries, the traditional background had been about splitting the inheritance of the father among the various sons, right, without much of a predilection for one, right? So primogeniture took a greater time to affirm itself, especially in this northward again, because there were less ways to enforce it, right? So the others wanted their own chunk, albeit always struggling for the top while they had it. So this is the process that eventually brings to a more vertical development. In this period of civil war lasting for essentially more than 1 century, was triggered by the alliances of the various sons that were bearing also a sacred blood, rather than just a royal one, to which was already the thing, as we've seen, but had increased fundamentally since the sanctity of Olaf. And it was separated by also periods of peace, right? It was not continuous warfare, right? But mostly a period highlighting the limits of centralization, and that were actually surpassed through these wars, right? The church also increased dramatically in power. The Archdiocese of Nidaros, created in 1152, attempted to even control the appointment of kings. This had happened in other realities as well, right? The church was fundamentally supported towards the monarchy, but exactly to claiming sort of moral superiority on it, determining whether it could be fit or not. Think about the councils of Toledo and Visigothic Spain, but even the investiture controversy, right? The Church of Rome is naturally backing the local church that pursues its own autonomous policies, but also because in this way this church was hierarchically recognizing the one of Rome could interfere improperly in the temporal affairs of Norway, also as far as lay government was concerned. So the church essentially took side in these conflicts, right, by say affirming the fitness or unfitness this or that ruler. And these wars fundamentally slowed down in 1217 with the appointment of Hakonson, essentially by exhaustion of the other contendants, at least the realization that perennial struggle wasn't really the way of going, because the costs were surpassing the benefits, even of the various egoisms involved. And Hakon is an extraordinary figure. Is the one who was offered the High Kingship of Ireland, or even actually the imperial, Holy Roman Imperial title, the commander of a French crusading fleet, right? Also because these Scandinavian kings had retained actually a bit of a maritime kind of Viking style vocation, especially in the case of, well, not only, right, because most of the Leidang overseas expeditions were now directed in the Baltic, where the Danes and the Swedes carried out their own crusades, right? The Norwegians also went literally to the Holy Land, actually, with Sigurd, and they helped capturing Lisbona, for example, in along the way, together with other crusaders. Hakon the Fourth of Norway introduced clear succession laws to say, okay, let's make it clear who is going to succeed, so that we have at least a legal basis for it, and codify, of course, with oaths of allegiance, all these things. So this is the full 13th century, so it's the peak of medieval civilization as far as also the feudal chivalric kingship is concerned. Hakon also managed to subject Greenland and Iceland, say, back to Norwegian rule, or at least interfering more directly with these lands that were still Norwegians, right? And in this sense, the period of the Icelandic Commonwealth that had essentially lasted since the Norwegian colonization of the island till this point came to an end, after which began the so-called Age of the Sturlungs, which was essentially a civil war in Iceland, in which the Norwegian kings backed family, right, was the Sturlungs one, the one also from which Snorri Sturluson, the great sagas writer, came from. In fact, he was entrusted by the king with this important task of regulating Iceland on his behalf. He came back to Iceland after having visited Norway, and he left things more or less as they were. But his nephew was a bit more enterprising, and he started literally a war that engulfed the country with an important series of clashes, as we've seen, very small ones in perspective, but that were quite important for the scale still of the local communities. Snorri was eventually killed in the struggles, and it was his brother that eventually came to power, essentially bringing like the island legally under the Kingdom of Norway, with some important conditions, such as the fact that the Norwegian king had to provide with justice, right, with a code of law, with the possibility, of course, of intervening militarily, as it had happened also during this time, BSE, of course, and also essentially establishing the juridical equality of Norwegians and Icelanders wherever they were, so that if you were an Icelander, you wanted to go to Norway, you had exactly the same rights as the Norwegian inhabitants, right? Because, as you understand, of course, they had already diversified a little bit. And this Norwegian victory, at least the victory of the pro-royal part in Iceland, naturally shows also the dependence of Iceland on Norway that would last, in fact, for centuries. And this shows naturally also the reinforcement of the feudal state that Norway had gradually become. In this phase of high medieval Norway, local population increased dramatically, right? Actually, much more even than in relative terms, than other countries, because we're not sure to the last unit, but in size, like between 150,000 to 400,000 inhabitants, from 1,000 to 1300 AD. This is a massive increase, right? And it resulted in more land being cleared, also the subdivision of farms. This wasn't exactly advantageous for the commoners, because essentially this enormous demographic growth meant less land, or at least land that had to be found even in, less hospitable places just to survive, right? And in the process, it was the nobility that led fundamentally the dance, meaning that it was under a lord, as we've seen, that these farmers could just colonize, etc. Of course, this process escaped in part the same nobiliary direction, but as we've seen, Norway was also scarcely stratified socially by continental standards, so this meant that people were somehow moved millennia. In any case, this period sees the increase of both royal and nobiliary power in a feudal way, exactly because of such important need of new land. favoring the church, the king, the aristocracy. The peasantry would borrow money in meager times. They wouldn't be able to repay the lords. And you just see that there are, however, still an important amount of freemen, right? And that many of them also managed to settle in faraway areas where they would be the rulers, as a matter of fact, even expanding again in the Finnmark, in areas that were also just less interesting for the monarchy by some degree, or at least where colonization was somehow incentivized, but as a sort of proxy mechanism. It's been estimated that during the 13th century, the average Norwegian farmer's yield went to the king, church, and landowners by 1/5, right? Which is a lot, actually, considering the crop rate of the time. In the 13th century, however, Norway enjoys her golden age, like as most European powers during this time of the millennium. There is finally peace after a quite violent past, thus also an increase in trade, especially with Britain, albeit Germany began particularly important towards especially the end of the 13th century for reasons that we've seen, especially looking at Danish history, even that Norway was continuously influenced by what was still the most powerful Scandinavian monarchy. The Jutland, as we've seen, had just been more exposed to the Holy Roman Empire's pressure, so had consolidated faster, but at this time an important amount, especially of German mercenaries, takes over an important degree of Scandinavian power. We've seen it in Germany, in Denmark. It's not just about say dynasties that eventually in the late Middle Ages would install themselves, coming from the Mecklenburg. We will see it now, that we're summing a bit all the Scandinavian monarchies, but we're talking properly about adventurers, about the military, right? You see this happening everywhere that Germany had, especially the German knightly class had been suffering an important crisis. Germany was very populous as well, and so lots of these soldiers go abroad searching for fortune. We've seen it in Italy, in Scandinavia. The interesting thing being that in Scandinavia they literally take control at a point, right? And this chapter in Scandinavian history, in my opinion, deserves much more consideration, especially in comparison with the Italian one, and in function of the German mercenaries. We can make a video about that at some point. There is naturally, like in other feudal countries at this point, the creation of probably of a crown, with a central administration and local representatives, right? So the beginning, the gradual, slow beginning of a true administrative centralization, with the king's representative that is trying locally to oust a little bit the local nobility, right? That is also using important administrators. Mostly they are, I don't know, merchants, knights, people were subcontracted a particular business, right? And that eventually came to be ever more permanent figures covering specific offices in the royal administration. Now, with the Black Death, a lot of interesting things happen in Norway. Because first of all, this was devastating. It seemingly killed within a year, 1349, when it arrived there. Studies say even almost 2/3 of the population, which to me seems a bit too high. And anyhow, it's just the beginning, because later plagues halved the population by year 1400. This is a heavy blow, right? It means many communities were entirely wiped out. This, however, and we saw it in that video I made about cattle breeding in late medieval Europe, Norway becomes one of the most important animal husbandry economy in Europe, right? Because there was a lot of land abandoned, right? Literally, the population had died, so many farmers switched to this type of land exploitation. Of course, this was a massive tragedy for the population at large in general, but the reduction, and we will see this will take an interesting political institutional balance, the reduction in taxes that could just be asked, from again, a community that shrank dramatically, weakened the Norwegian monarchy, right? The same aristocrats lost an important part of their surplus, right? And they weakened to the point of becoming essential farmers, right? As we've seen, less social stratification means, first of all, there are less resources, it's a more fragile, primitive system, but also it's easier to fall to some sort of, not even gentry by some degree because of such impoverishment. Who survived better instead was the church, because of the ecclesiastical immunities and perhaps in fact a more unitary administration of some sort, given that at least the church doesn't split, in the possessions every time a bishop dies, and etc. Don't get me wrong, it was always the aristocracy who ruled the church, but the mechanism for which the church land would be passed down from office to office was of course much more linear than the one of the lay aristocracy. And of course there was a big deal also of fights for maintaining the same church land intact, and as we've seen, the church interfered with lay policy, and they hired mercenaries and all this stuff. This is the reason why Norway, at a certain point, the archbishop becomes a member of the Council of State. Right, Council of State of Norway is still existing, right, as essentially the Norwegian government. And the Hanseatic League, at this point, takes advantage of the Norwegian monarchic weakness, and it starts penetrating the country in the 14th century, establishing trading posts in most Norwegian port cities, such as Oslo and Bergen, which had the largest German colony. So just as German mercenaries are coming, installing themselves partly in the land and participating to the political dialectic, also German economy, and one of the Hanseatic League is Hungary from her side. It's more pervasive because it's basically, in fact, a union of towns that have their strength in essentially their middle position between this point of fragmented Germany and, in fact, a weakened Scandinavian reality. And they can literally blackmail, say, the King of England, like, if you don't trade with one of us, we will blockade you altogether. And so they're enjoying a bit this statal collapse, this sort of refeudalization. And they start blackmailing, in fact, the same Norwegian monarchy, right? As you know, the Hanseatic League would keep harassing the north, even up to the modern age. I mean, at some point they sacked Copenhagen and so on. So they had a quite dynamic, aggressive piracy, right? It sometimes wasn't even like the Hanseatic League is, as we just said, not really dominated by a city-state or another, like the Italian maritime republics. It's a very permeable league, in which also some feudal powers enter, and exploit the situation. The Mecklenburg, the Pomeranians, in fact, will intervene in Scandinavian policy through the control, in part, of these, at least the cooperation, because the Hanseatic League was always very freely spirited in a way. This German communes. The King Olaf Håkonsson in 1380 inherited both the Norwegian and the Danish thrones. This created essentially the union, say, a more after the Viking era issues, like a more solid union between the two countries, at least one that was preluding to one that was always problematic, as we will see. In 1397, under Margaret I, who was the daughter of the King of Valdemar of Denmark, that had somehow recompacted the country after a period also of German, in fact, marauderies and so on, ascends to the Norwegian throne because her 17-year-old son and King of Norway died when he was 17, right? She also became Queen of Sweden, and this gave rise to the so-called Kalmarunionen. That is to say, in fact, a dynastic sum of the three Scandinavian countries, beyond which, as we know, we can read, of course, the preeminence of Denmark. Consider that the country was more populous than Norway and Sweden put together. Norway was the smallest of these countries, and also the easier to control from Denmark, right? Because of the aforementioned reason, the richest places are in the south of Norway, so they're just exposed from the sea to Denmark. This is in part true for Sweden. If it wasn't for the fact that it has a much bigger hinterland that is also very complicated to enter in. Some of the most important centers, such as Stockholm, are from the other side of the Scandinavian peninsula, and also some of the most profitable resources of Sweden are in the hinterland, right? So the Swedish monarchy was the one that took more time to build. The Danish one was, as we've seen, just more facilitated by her location and also some features. Norway was also a relatively early monarchy because it was more compact. Again, you have just these bays in the fjords and not much of an hinterland, so you can all in a row try to more easily compact the country, but it wasn't as powerful naturally as Denmark nor as Sweden, as a matter of fact. It's important to stress, however, that Norway controlled in medieval times some areas of western Sweden, which historically were in fact Norwegian, but things eventually went otherwise. But this is also the consequence of this kind of instability we're looking at. Denmark was also more involved in German policy, at least trying to stem it. And the dynamic that forms is essentially a rejection, not just of what was perceived essentially like a Danish rule in Scandinavia, which was real by a degree. I mean, the way these dynasts would see each other was again very traditional. You can't say they were either of one nationality or the other, right? Of course, there was a prevalence, in this case even the Danish element, but they were all married into each other, and they saw themselves primarily as dynasts, because Denmark controlled the coasts, and that was enough by some degree even to control the exports. And since Denmark was at war with German powers in the area, she had also suffered important reverses at the hands of the neighboring counties and so on, would first of all be countering the Hanseatic League and the trade, the Scandinavian exports to Germany. In the case of Sweden, importantly the iron mines, the iron ore, uh, that caused great discontent in Scandinavia. Because try to see it from this perspective. I mean, the state had collapsed, and actually, as you understand, not for the good reasons, because the system had just become more unstable and privatized and problematic. But in this sense, the local lords kind of could act again in that mobster-like fashion to disintegrate this public authority, to smuggle stuff to Germany against the Danish will that was just trying essentially to recompact a bit the situation, and after all, exploiting this, this dynastic accomplishment that was having, a single king at a time, single ruler over all three countries, which had a lot of potential. And thus, also most Norwegian nobility opposed themselves to this direction, the Danish direction too, right? While Margaret was waging war against the Hanse, the Norwegians, not just the Swedes, rebel, right? This is the Engelbrecht rebellion that lasted between 1434 and 1436. This was a Swedish leader who, again, had been exploiting mostly this discontent in the Swedish hinterland that the Danish didn't have properly the resources to even control. At this point, the Norwegian and its Council of State was too weak to secede from the Union at the same time. So it was just like a suspensed reality, in which Margaret kept pursuing a centralizing policy, which unavoidably favored Denmark. We have seen this in other contexts of dynastic sums, right? Like in Central Europe, you marry into each other, hoping to, first of all, to procreate, so that your line doesn't go extinguished, but especially, hopefully, to inherit entire kingdoms. And when that happens, by biological accident, you cannot literally rule everywhere, right? At this point, the medieval courts are still very much not necessarily itinerant, but rulers have different places they can rule from. They have to be present to negotiate with the local assemblies, and they have often to do it in arms, right? So the favored policy that makes more sense is that you inherit, like in this case, 3 kingdoms. Well, okay, you essentially negotiate with 2 about how much they owe you and what they give you. You will concentrate in the place, the third one where you rule from. Naturally, this entails that the other 2 kingdoms are more reluctant to give you resources that are going to be spent for essentially another monarchy that is actually, in this case, increasing power on them. So it gets less resources than it would if you had been ruling from there, but it's also unavoidable because ruling from the actual places takes a lot of resources, continuous warfare, and it's just a mess. Eventually, as we know, this other, especially starting from Sweden, that was less manageable than Norway. In fact, the Kalmar Union breaks down. Margaret, in this had in part granted trade privileges to the same Hanseatic merchants of Lübeck. It was the founding and most important center, trying to, put it against the others, because there were essentially 4 chunks of the Hanseatic League, mostly Hamburg, Bremen, Stralsund, and so on, and smaller ones. And these trades were provided for trade rights for Bergen in Norway as well. So also drawing part of that dynamism from from the North Sea side as opposed to the Baltic one. Also crossing through the straits between Denmark and Scania. That is part actually of the Danish monarchy in the Middle Ages, properly as a kingdom, even though it's today's Sweden, of course. There were other less gentle elements sailing around, such as the so-called Victual Brothers, who were essentially some pirates, not differently from what the same Vikings had historically been, who organized literally a guild of privateers, including initially mostly the Mecklenburg nobility that, as we've seen, was also part of the country that would involve itself dynastically in Scandinavia. And that, however, was joined by lots of other, like the scum of the earth, right, and turning in outright piracy. But admittedly, there wasn't much of a difference between like a civilian and military activity in the Middle Ages, right? There was, towards the end of it, an increasing distinction between the two. Let's say even as far as naval engineering was concerned, the type of vessels and so on, but everybody was militarily, more or less militarily equipped, and they would seize the opportunities, harassing also the Norwegian coast, who in fact launched 3 devastating raids on the same Bergen, the last in 1427, exactly to bother Margaret and the interests of Lubeck that had been granted in that port. In any case, throughout all this, Norway was emerging as a kind of country ever more, modernly speaking. So also with an important degree of political and institutional autonomy, right? Also aside from these dynastic sums. In this phase, towards the very end of the Middle Ages, Norway was, let's say, while defining, of course, herself ever more politically and institutionally as a country, however, losing importance in relative terms in this kind of broader Scandinavian commonwealth, let's say, and especially during the Oldenburg dynasty that was established in 1450, it felt ever more in the background. Consider that Olaf IV of Norway, that was also king of Denmark and Margaret's son, would be the last Norwegian-born king to rule in the country for a very long time to come. Essentially, as we've seen, just like with the extinction of the fair-haired dynasty, this was also yet another extinction of a male line of the Norwegian kings, which brought to the Sudreim claim to the Norwegian throne at a point multiple times. The most important one under Knut Alvsson in 1502. In fact, this family descended, albeit illegitimately, but still from a former king of Norway. So they had something to say in the process, and they would step further, but also at other times they realized there were too many other powerful competitors. There was kind of a better phase. This thing wouldn't succeed, but Christian II of Denmark is normally considered to have been not such a bad ruler after all in Norway. This brought, in fact, in the 20s of the 16th century, Norway not to support essentially the Swedish achievement of independence from Denmark, the destinies of Norway would remain connected with the Danish ones eventually, as you know. So in the 19th century, Sweden kind of instead was in personal union with Norway. That's another history. And actually, there are lots of things to say that I skipped here, as you understand. So I kept it general, just to give an idea of the situation. However, we will hopefully talk more again about Norwegian history. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.